Over the past 4 weeks, we've been reflecting on stewardship, and we define stewardship as taking care of the things that God has entrusted to us, things that belong to Him but are given to us to tend and care for. And we drew for that on Genesis chapter 2, where God places Adam in the Garden of Eden and charges him to tend and care for the garden. And so over these 4 weeks, we've looked at 4 aspects of stewardship. We've talked about stewarding ourselves, stewarding our communion or our church fellowship, stewarding the things that we have, particularly or specifically our money, our finances, and lastly, about stewarding our world, the society in which we live in with its people, as well as the world as a planet and an ecosystem. And we've been suggesting that all of these things that God gives to us, He gives to us generously and kindly and freely, and then invites us to use them to build up His kingdom in this world. And although, of course, some of these things might feel a bit challenging, particularly when we're talking about finance, obviously then that, kind of touches into our pockets, and that may be a little harder. But often the other things that we talk about may seem quite nice and easy. And so it's interesting that today the lectionary gives our reading as Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. So the last half of Luke 14, which in the NIV is titled The Cost of Discipleship. The cost of discipleship. I think in many ways discipleship is very closely linked to what we're saying about stewardship. To be a disciple means to be a follower of Christ, to walk in His footsteps, to learn from Him, and to begin to shape ourselves on His example. In a sense, we each become transformed into His likeness. Even though, of course, we're each different and we have different gifts and different personalities, and so we will all still be unique and different. Yet at the same time, there is a common kind of quality about all of us who follow Christ, because in a sense we model ourselves on Him. And so that, I think, is stewarding, isn't it? It is about taking care of the things that God has given to us. But what we get in this passage, in a sense, is a sober judgment about discipleship and stewardship. And Jesus explains to us that it is not easy. It is not easy. And He gives us 2 key messages, and I want to talk you through those quite briefly this morning. The first part of the message is that discipleship and stewardship will cost us. It will not come free. It might come easy for some people, but it should cost us. We talked about, when I talked about finance, to say, give as much as you can, but also give until it's uncomfortable. Just push yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone to that point of discomfort. And in the first part of this passage, Luke chapter 14, verse 26, Jesus says these very strong and challenging words that for many of us are quite hard, not quite hard, very hard to swallow. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. These are hard words from Jesus about the cost of discipleship. Now, when we look at the whole of Jesus' teachings, we understand that He cannot genuinely mean that we have to hate our family members. But what He is doing is He's drawing this contrast between our love for God compared to our love for everything else. And this love, this commitment to God has to transcend our commitment to everything else. Of course, when we love God, we will love our neighbor. These are the great commandments. So loving God cannot mean hating our neighbor, particularly when our neighbor is our family, our spouse, our children, our parents. Of course, Jesus is not literally saying that we need to hate them. He is trying to show the contrast between these two. And ultimately, what he is saying in this first half is that we do need to give in a way that is radical, that is genuine, that is not just well, I've got a few extra cents that I don't need, so let me throw it on the collection plate. That's not what he wants. He wants a sincere, genuine commitment that pushes us to a point of discomfort, to a point where we know that we're stretching ourselves, where we're giving, and I don't only mean financially, I mean in all of these ways we've reflected on, that we give in a way till it hurts a bit. And this is not a kind of a martyrdom thing that he's saying either. He's not saying that we need to hate life and that life needs to be miserable, because we can see from his own life that he had good times with his disciples as well, and good times with other people. But we do have to have this genuine, deep, strong commitment that pushes us out of our comfort zones into God's ministry. The second point that Jesus makes, which almost sounds like it is contradictory, is that we really have to count the cost. In other words, we have to think quite carefully about what it is that God is wanting us to do, and we have to plan for it. He is not inviting us here to a kind of blind faith where we just close our eyes and jump in and then see what the consequences might be. He gives us two examples where the pattern that he calls us to is one of careful consideration and planning. So in the first example in verse 28, he says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? Won't you first sit down and consider the cost to ensure that you have enough money to complete it? He's asking us to be sensible with our finances, sensible with our resources, and to ensure that when we say we're going to do something, we can actually bring it to completion, that we can actually afford it. So he's not asking for a recklessness from us. Can you hear that? This is what he's describing here is the opposite of recklessness. It is about being careful, thoughtful, making a judicious decision. And then he continues with a second example in verse 31 where he says, or suppose a king is about to go out to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? There's two things here that I really like. The first is that he makes it clear that the odds are stacked against us. In this metaphor, this parable, the king has only 10,000 people, whereas his enemy has 20,000. The odds are stacked against us. This is not going to be easy. But again, we get exactly those same words. Won't he first sit down and consider? Exactly the same words. In verse 28, won't you first sit down and estimate? The invitation, friends, is not to be reckless and thoughtless and stupid. The invitation to stewardship and discipleship, even though Jesus has very high expectations of what he wants from us, is to be thoughtful about it and to think it through carefully. In a sense, once we make a decision about what we're going to give or how we're going to serve, he wants to be sure that we can stick it out, that we don't just do it for a day. This is not like some people do where on Christmas they go and buy a puppy and then by New Year they've let it loose because they can't actually look after it. This is not that kind of commitment. What Jesus wants from us is a commitment that is both radical and feasible, practicable, something we can actually do. And so I invite you, particularly those of us at St. Stephen's, who are now preparing our commitment for 2021 in our finances as well as in our ministry in the church, to do both of these things, to be radical and to push ourselves into places of discomfort where we're giving a bit more than we would feel comfortable to give, but also to do so carefully, to sit down and to consider what you can do, and then make a decision that is smart and practicable. So I wish you well during this week as we, us particularly at St. Stephen's in Littleton, think through our commitment to Christ. But for anyone else who's listening or watching and who's not currently busy with having to make a formal commitment to their church by writing something on a piece of paper, let's reflect carefully, thoughtfully, rigorously. Let's interrogate our hearts about our commitment to God's work in this world. May God bless you and help you to make wise decisions.